In the blood-soaked halls of the Kremlin, where paranoia was currency and suspicion was survival, Joseph Stalin eliminated anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Generals, politicians, even his closest allies, all met the same fate. A bullet to the back of the head or a slow death in the gulags. But there was one man who defied this deadly pattern. A soldier. A warlord. A legend forged in the fire of battlefields and blood. A man who openly criticized Stalin's decisions, who commanded the unwavering loyalty of millions of soldiers, and who became more beloved by the Soviet people than Stalin himself. Yet somehow, this man not only survived Stalin's reign of terror, he thrived in it. His name was Georgy Zhukov, and this is the extraordinary story of how a peasant's son became the one person Stalin feared but could never bring himself to destroy. Zhukov was not a politician. He didn't flatter Stalin. He didn't cower before power. He commanded it. He rose from a humble peasant background, scraping his way through the brutal ranks of the Red Army. By the time Hitler turned his sights on the Soviet Union, Zhukov had already become the iron hammer of Soviet defense. While others buckled under pressure, he didn't flinch. When the Nazis stormed across the Eastern Front, it was Zhukov who stopped them, at Leningrad, at Stalingrad, and finally in the ruins of Berlin. He didn't just fight battles, he won them. He didn't beg Stalin's favor, he forced it. How do you destroy a man who saved your entire nation? How do you eliminate someone whose very name inspires loyalty in millions of soldiers? How do you kill a living legend without destroying the myth of Soviet invincibility you've worked so hard to create? Stalin tried everything short of assassination. He demoted Zhukov, exiled him, erased him from history books, and subjected him to constant surveillance. But he could never take the final step. And in that failure lies one of the most compelling stories of survival, power, and the deadly dance between genius and paranoia that defined the Soviet Union. The peasant's origins. The story begins in 1896, in the forgotten village of Strelkovka in Russia, where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a way of life. Georgy Zhukov was born 1st of December 1896 into a world where survival meant everything and opportunity meant nothing. His mother, Ustanya, worked the fields with calloused hands, pulling vegetables from the unforgiving Russian soil. His father, Konstantin, was a cobbler whose worn tools and weathered face told the story of a man fighting against destitution. But even in this bleak landscape, young Georgy showed something different. While other children played, he observed. While others accepted their fate, he questioned it. At just 12 years old, he was sent to Moscow to work as an apprentice furrier, a chance his family couldn't afford to refuse. 12-hour days, brutal treatment from supervisors, and the constant ache of exhaustion became his daily reality. Yet in the evenings, when others collapsed from fatigue, Zhukov attended night school, devouring books and learning German from his cousin Alex. This wasn't just education. It was preparation for a destiny he couldn't yet imagine. The furrier's apprentice was unknowingly forging the iron will that would one day break the Wehrmacht and make Stalin himself lose sleep. Baptism by fire. When World War I erupted in 1914, it swept through Russia like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. The young Zhukov felt the pull of patriotism, a force stronger than his uncle's pleas to avoid military service. "It is my duty to defend the motherland," he declared, words that would echo through his entire life. Assigned to the cavalry due to his skills with leather and horses, Zhukov quickly distinguished himself. In August 1916, during fighting on the Moldovan front, he captured a German officer and interrogated him in German, that language his cousin had taught him years earlier. The intelligence he gathered was so valuable that he was awarded the St. George Cross, the first of countless decorations that would follow. But Zhukov wasn't just brave, he was different. While other officers ruled through fear and brutality, he led by example. He encouraged rather than terrorized his men, and they loved him for it. When the Tsar fell in 1917 and the army dissolved into political chaos, Zhukov's soldiers elected him as their regimental Soviet delegate. At just 21, He wielded the kind of authority that men twice his age could only dream of. The Russian Civil War was a crucible that forged legends, or destroyed them. Zhukov chose to be forged. Joining the Red Army in 1918, he plunged into some of the most savage fighting in human history. These weren't battles fought with artillery and trenches. They were desperate cavalry charges where men hacked at each other with sabers, where survival depended on split-second decisions and raw courage. In one terrifying encounter, Zhukov recalled a white Russian soldier firing at him point-blank, killing his horse and pinning him beneath its weight. Death seemed certain until Commissar Novchevka charged in, cutting down the enemy with his saber and pulling Zhukov to safety. These were the moments that shaped the future marshal, not in classrooms or staff meetings, but in the deadly dance of mounted warfare on the Russian steppes. His reputation grew with each victory. Bolshevik officials desperately needed reliable leaders, and Zhukov's combination of tactical brilliance and unshakable loyalty made him invaluable. Promotion followed promotion, but more importantly, he was building something that would later terrify Stalin: the absolute devotion of his soldiers. The victory that changed everything. The Battle of Kokhin-Gol in 1939 was where Zhukov announced himself to the world. The Japanese had been probing Soviet defenses for years, but no one had been able to deliver a decisive blow. Zhukov would change that forever. Facing 30,000 Japanese soldiers of the elite Guandong Army, supported by tanks and aircraft, Zhukov commanded 63,000 Red Army troops and Mongolian cavalry. But numbers alone wouldn't win this battle. It required something that would become Zhukov's signature: brilliant deception. Feigning a traditional World War I-style frontal assault, complete with heavy bombardment, Zhukov secretly maneuvered his tanks around the Japanese flanks. While the enemy focused on the artillery barrage to their front, Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks swept around their sides like steel pincers. The Japanese Sixth Army was completely encircled and destroyed. The victory was so complete, so devastating, that Japan would never again seriously consider attacking the Soviet Union. Zhukov had saved Siberia, and in doing so, he had mastered the art of encirclement warfare that would later destroy the Wehrmacht. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, crashed into the Soviet Union like a tsunami of steel and fire. In the first weeks, the Red Army suffered losses that defied comprehension. Entire army groups vanished, millions of soldiers were killed or captured, and the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. And who was in charge of the Red Army during this catastrophe? Georgy Zhukov. Any other dictator would have had him shot immediately. The failure was so complete, so humiliating, that finding a scapegoat would have been simple. But Stalin did something unprecedented. He kept Zhukov alive and gave him an impossible mission: save Moscow. Why? Because Stalin understood something that his paranoia usually prevented him from seeing. Zhukov was the only man who could turn the tide. The only commander with the skill, the will, and the trust of the troops needed to stop the German juggernaut. In October 1941, German forces were so close to Moscow that Hitler's officers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. The Soviet government was evacuating. Panic gripped the city, and the Wehrmacht was preparing for their final, triumphant assault. But they hadn't counted on Zhukov. Pulling his old encirclement trick, Zhukov launched a counteroffensive north of Moscow that caught the Germans completely off guard. The Red Army, written off as finished, suddenly struck back with coordinated attacks that halted the German advance. The harsh Russian winter became Zhukov's ally, and what had seemed like certain victory for the Wehrmacht turned into their first major defeat. Moscow was saved. The Soviet Union survived. And Zhukov had proven that the invincible German war machine could be stopped. From that moment forward, Zhukov's career read like a catalogue of the Eastern Front's most crucial battles. Stalingrad, where his planning helped encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army. Kursk, where he turned the Wehrmacht's last great offensive into a crushing defeat. Operation Bagration, where he shattered German Army Group Center and opened the road to Berlin. Each victory added to his legend. Soviet soldiers didn't just respect Zhukov, they worshipped him. They believed he was invincible, that following him meant victory was certain. General Konstantin Rokossovsky captured Zhukov's essence. Has a strong will, decisive and firm. Often demonstrates initiative and skillfully applies it. Absolutely cannot be used in staff or teaching jobs because constitutionally he hates them. Zhukov was a warrior, not a politician. He fought with brutal efficiency, telling his soldiers, "Remember our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, our wives and children tortured to death by the Germans. We shall exact a brutal revenge for everything." That's exactly what he did all the way to Berlin. On May 8, 1945, in a bunker beneath the ruins of Hitler's capital, Georgy Zhukov accepted the German instrument of surrender. The peasant boy from Strelkovka had become the man who ended the Third Reich. Photos from that day show a confident commander, decorated with medals, signing documents that would reshape the world. But in Moscow, Stalin was not celebrating. He was calculating. To the Soviet people, Zhukov was the greatest hero in their history. They believed he had single-handedly driven the fascists from their land and beaten Hitler into submission. He was more popular than Stalin himself, and that was a problem. Zhukov commanded something that Stalin never truly possessed: the absolute loyalty of the Red Army. Whether in command or not, Zhukov could walk into any Soviet headquarters and the soldiers would follow him anywhere. Soldiers didn't sing songs about Stalin's tactical brilliance. They sang about Zhukov's victories. When foreign dignitaries visited Moscow, they asked to meet the famous Marshal Zhukov, not the political leaders who had remained safely in the Kremlin. This terrified Stalin more than any foreign enemy ever could. Stalin's paranoia about military leaders was not irrational. It was based on historical precedent. Throughout Russian history, successful generals had often become political threats. Military coups were a constant danger in societies where the army held real power. Stalin himself had risen to power partly by eliminating potential rivals, and he knew that others might try to do the same to him. But Zhukov presented a unique challenge. Unlike the general Stalin had purged in the 1930s, Zhukov was not just popular with the military elite, he was beloved by ordinary soldiers and civilians alike. His victories had saved the Soviet Union from destruction. To eliminate him would be to eliminate the symbol of Soviet military prowess. The dangerous hero. Stalin's first move was subtle but significant. In May 1945, just days after the German surrender, Stalin recalled Zhukov from Berlin and appointed him to command the Odessa military district, a prestigious posting, but one that removed him from the center of power. The official reason was that Zhukov was needed to help reorganize the Red Army for peacetime, but the real reason was that Stalin wanted him away from the spotlight. He couldn't simply have him killed. Zhukov was too popular, too important, too dangerous. The victory parade in Red Square on June 24, 1945, became a symbolic battleground between the two men. Originally, Stalin had planned to review the parade himself, riding a white horse in a dramatic display of leadership. But when Stalin tried to ride the horse in a practice session, he was thrown. Rather than risk embarrassment, he assigned the honor to Zhukov. The sight of Zhukov on his white horse, reviewing the troops who had conquered Berlin, was everything Stalin had feared. The crowds cheered wildly. The soldiers snapped to attention with obvious pride. Foreign observers took note of the man who seemed to embody Soviet military might. Stalin watched from the reviewing stand, his face an expressionless mask, but those who knew him could see the fury in his eyes. From that moment on, Stalin's campaign against Zhukov intensified. He began to remove Zhukov's allies from key positions. He ordered investigations into Zhukov's wartime decisions, looking for any evidence of incompetence or disloyalty. He started promoting other generals, creating a new generation of military leaders who owed their positions to Stalin rather than to Zhukov. But every move Stalin made was carefully calculated. He couldn't simply arrest Zhukov as he had done with so many others during the purges. The international situation was too delicate, the marshal's reputation too secure, the risk of military backlash too great. Stalin needed a different approach, one that would neutralize Zhukov without making him a martyr. Simultaneously, Stalin began to rewrite the history of the war. In official accounts, Stalin's role as supreme commander was emphasized while Zhukov's contributions were minimized. The defense of Moscow became Stalin's strategic masterpiece, with Zhukov relegated to the role of a competent but subordinate executor of the great leader's plans. The victory at Stalingrad was credited to Stalin's genius, not to the tactical brilliance of field commanders. This historical revisionism was particularly galling to Zhukov, who had lived through these battles and knew the truth. But speaking out would have been tantamount to treason. Stalin controlled the press, the publishing houses, and the historical institutes. Any attempt by Zhukov to correct the record would have been seen as an attack on Stalin's authority. The second phase of Stalin's campaign involved direct intimidation. In 1946, Stalin ordered the secret police to investigate Zhukov's wartime activities. The charges were vague but menacing. Unauthorized contacts with foreign officers, theft of German trophies, and the cultivation of personal loyalty among subordinates. None of these charges were serious enough to justify execution, but they were sufficient to create an atmosphere of threat and uncertainty. The investigation revealed some minor infractions. Zhukov had indeed kept some war trophies, as had most Soviet commanders. But Stalin wasn't looking for evidence of major crimes. He was looking for leverage, for ways to keep Zhukov off balance and remind him of his vulnerability. The psychological pressure was enormous. Zhukov knew that many of his colleagues from the war years had been arrested or demoted. He knew that Stalin's favor could disappear overnight. He began to limit his public appearances, avoid controversial statements, and demonstrate his loyalty through increasingly elaborate gestures of submission. But Stalin's most effective weapon against Zhukov was isolation. One by one, Zhukov's wartime allies were removed from positions of influence. General Ivan Konev, who had been Zhukov's rival during the war, was promoted to positions of greater responsibility. New military leaders who had no connection to Zhukov's wartime achievements were brought into the high command. By 1947, Zhukov found himself commanding a relatively unimportant military district, surrounded by officers who owed their careers to Stalin rather than to him, and increasingly cut off from the centers of power in Moscow. He was still alive, still technically respected, but his influence was effectively neutralized. The genius of Stalin's approach was that it avoided the risks associated with more dramatic action. There were no dramatic arrests that might provoke military unrest. There were no show trials that might focus international attention on Soviet internal politics. Zhukov was simply diminished, made irrelevant through 1,000 small cuts rather than one dramatic blow. The Untouchable Survivor. Despite Stalin's methodical campaign, Zhukov possessed several advantages that made him uniquely difficult to destroy. The first was his genuine popularity with ordinary soldiers and citizens. Unlike many of Stalin's previous victims, who were known primarily to the political elite, Zhukov was a household name throughout the Soviet Union. His victories had been celebrated in newspapers, commemorated in songs, and honored in public ceremonies. This popular support created a protective shield around Zhukov. Any move against him would have to be explained to the Soviet people, who remembered him as the savior of Moscow and the conqueror of Berlin. Stalin, for all his power, was still dependent on public support for his legitimacy. He couldn't simply eliminate the most popular military hero in Soviet history without risking a dangerous backlash. The second advantage was Zhukov's international reputation. By 1945, he was arguably the most famous Soviet military leader in the world. Western journalists had interviewed him, foreign governments had decorated him, and his name was synonymous with the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. Eliminating such a prominent figure would have created serious diplomatic complications at a time when Stalin was trying to establish the Soviet Union as a major world power. The third advantage was the delicate balance of power within the Soviet military. Zhukov's elimination would have sent a clear message to other military leaders that no one was safe, no matter how distinguished their service. This might have provoked the kind of military unrest that Stalin was desperately trying to avoid. The Red Army was still largely intact, still commanded by officers who had served under Zhukov during the war, and still capable of posing a threat to Stalin's regime if pushed too far. Perhaps most importantly, Zhukov himself proved to be a master of political survival. He seemed to understand instinctively what Stalin needed from him: complete submission and public loyalty. Unlike some of Stalin's other victims who had fought back or tried to defend themselves, Zhukov adopted a strategy of strategic retreat. He accepted demotions without complaint, praised Stalin's leadership in public, and avoided any action that might be interpreted as a challenge to the dictator's authority. This wasn't cowardice, it was a sophisticated understanding of how to survive in Stalin's Soviet Union. Zhukov recognized that direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, he played the long game, maintaining his dignity while avoiding the fatal mistake of challenging Stalin's supremacy. The strategy worked. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Stalin's paranoia reached new heights and other prominent figures were arrested or executed, Zhukov remained untouched. He was marginalized, certainly, and his influence was severely limited. But he was alive, and in Stalin's Soviet Union, survival was the ultimate victory. There were moments when it seemed that Stalin might finally move against Zhukov. In 1950, during the height of Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign, some of Zhukov's former associates were arrested. In 1952, as Stalin prepared what appeared to be a new purge of the military leadership, Zhukov's name was mentioned in connection with various investigations. But each time Stalin pulled back. Whether it was concern about the political consequences, uncertainty about the military's reaction, or simply the recognition that Zhukov posed no immediate threat, Stalin never took the final step. Zhukov remained in his remote military district, carefully avoiding any action that might provoke the paranoid dictator's wrath. Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's chief of the NKVD, repeatedly tried to implicate Zhukov in plots and conspiracies. He fabricated evidence, coerced witnesses, and did everything in his power to give Stalin a reason to eliminate the troublesome marshal. But each time Stalin hesitated. The man who had ordered the deaths of millions couldn't bring himself to kill the one person who might be more powerful than himself. This wasn't mercy, it was fear. Stalin knew that executing Zhukov might trigger a revolt within the Red Army. The soldiers who had followed their marshal from Moscow to Berlin might not accept his murder quietly. The Kingmaker. When Stalin died in March 1953, his underlings scrambled to seize power. They formed coalitions, made deals, and plotted against each other in a deadly game of political chess. But there was one man who held the ultimate trump card, Georgy Zhukov. Whoever controlled Zhukov controlled the Red Army. And whoever controlled the Red Army controlled the Soviet Union. When Beria tried to position himself as Stalin's successor, Zhukov facilitated his destruction. The same man who had once lived in terror of midnight arrests now decided who lived and who died in the Kremlin. He had become the Kingmaker of the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev understood this reality. To secure his position, he needed Zhukov's support. The marshal was brought back from exile, appointed Minister of Defense, and given the respect he had always deserved. But even Khrushchev eventually grew wary of Zhukov's power and influence. The final victory. In 1957, disagreements with Khrushchev led to Zhukov's final removal from power. Accused of building a personality cult within the military, he was dismissed as Minister of Defense and forced into retirement. But this wasn't defeat, it was liberation. Zhukov had survived Stalin's paranoia, Hitler's Wehrmacht, and the brutal politics of the Soviet system. He had risen from peasant origins to become the most powerful man in the most powerful country on earth. He had faced down dictators and conquered empires. Most importantly, he had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had lived to tell his story. The Immortal Legacy. Georgy Zhukov died on June 18, 1974, but his legend lives on. Monuments across Russia honor his memory. Military academies study his tactics. Historians debate his methods. But perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us that even in the darkest times, courage and competence can triumph over fear and paranoia. Stalin killed millions, but he couldn't kill the one man who truly mattered. Zhukov didn't just survive Stalin. He outlived him, outmaneuvered him, and ultimately proved that talent and determination could overcome even the most ruthless tyranny. The peasant boy from Strelkovka became a marshal, a hero, and a legend. He was the one man Stalin feared and couldn't kill, and that made all the difference in the world.